Hello. All right, here we go. Module 12, I think it is. Talking about welding and hot work operations. Well, these are something that not everybody does. I'm not a welder, and my guess is a lot of you aren't welders. But accompanying this presentation of what I'm going to chat about here, there's two great videos that are done by welders about safety, and one's for electrical welding, one's for arc welding, and one's for gas welding, gas fuel welding. And you will learn a lot of stuff in those, and they're really good videos. Watch them and remember that anything that's in this module can be in the tests or chapters or finals. So let's get it going here. Now, I'm not going to do chapter and verse of the standard on this. It's pretty lengthy, but you should read it. I mean, that's your textbook. Those are standards of the textbook in this class. So you got to read the textbook. So, oops, let me out here. All right. Oh, well, that was chapter 13 in the online. That's module 12 now. Deal with it. So, welding operations. Welding, cutting, and brazing are hazardous activities that pose a unique combination of safety and health risks. This is an overview of 1910.252 arc welding and cutting. So let's go. Welding is permanently joining metal parts by applying heat to melt and fuse them together. Cutting is using heat to separate two pieces of metal by melting or vaporizing a portion of them. And brazing is using molten metal to join two pieces of metal. That's what those are. So here's just some of the just general hazards that are involved in the controls that are used to control those hazards. Hazards are burned from electric arc or flame, of course, it's hot. So you control your PPE, heavy leather gloves, long sleeve jackets, hood, a lot of those things. Ultraviolet radiation from the electric arc is a serious hazard. Do not downplay that, or that is bad news. Welders' helmet or glass to protect eyes, protective clothing, protect skin. We'll talk more about that. We'll talk about probably more a lot of these. The hazard thermal burns from infrared radiation from electric arc and other flame cutting equipment thermal burns. So these are just a burn like we get from the heat. Again, you have welders' helmet or glass to protect your eyes, protective clothing to protect the skin. Intense visible light, welder's helmet with dark faceplates to protect the welder and keep employees away from welding operations are used with PVC curtains. Hazardous fumes and gases. Ventilation, got to have ventilation, mechanical ventilation or local exhaust systems or a combination of both. You got to have good ventilation at any welding operation. Hazard, welding in confined spaces increase the risks of hazardous atmospheres. Now they're talking about, if you do this, you need to follow a well-written permit required confined space program, but they're also talking about in confined spaces, not necessarily permit required. They can say has a regular door to it, or just a small space too, because when you're in there and you're doing welding or cutting, you're using up the air in there by the burning, and the heat could be a problem, and even the noise because of the fact that it's a confined spaces. In any confined space, whether it's technically a permit required confined space or not, basically almost all hazards are amplified. And here's a hazard. Geez, people not working safely. Does that ever happen? Yeah, I bet. How do you control that? Training, monitoring employees, enforcement of safe work practices. Very important. Hazards, fires caused by welding operations. You think welders can cause fires? Well, they're basically creating a fire. So yeah, I guess so. Controls, remove flammables, cover those that cannot be moved with an appropriate tarp, and follow a well-written hot work policy. Hazard, compressed gas cylinders can become torpedoes. Controls, secure them during storage with caps in place. Do not store oxygen and acetylene together, and transport cylinders safely. Fire hazards, if the object to be welded or cut cannot really be moved, all movable fire hazards in the vicinity shall be taken to a safe place. Makes sense? That's if you want to take, the first thing you want to do if you have something, is to get in your shop or a welding spot that's designated for a welding area that's, kind of enclosed, ventilated, controlled. But sometimes that's not always possible. So now you got to go out and you got to weld out in a plant somewhere. So you got to move. All movable fire hazards got to be moved. Guards, if the object to be welded or cut cannot be moved, and if all the fire hazards cannot be removed, then guards shall be used to confine the heat, sparks, slag, and to protect the immovable fire hazards. And if these restrictions cannot be followed, then welding and cutting should not be performed. When they redid the Heavener plant a couple of years ago, well, a long time, because about 9 years ago now, there was a lot of stuff going on, had going on in the plant. And sometimes some of the stuff was already in place. And there were some flammable, belts and stuff like that. So you couldn't stop operations. They had to get the stuff done, but you could take precautions. So we had to put welding guards up and tarps over stuff. And they didn't want to sometimes, and I had to get on them about it sometimes. But it worked out, and we didn't have any major issues there. Although I didn't, me and some of the contractors butted heads a little bit, let's put it that way, and I won. Floor opening and cracks covered so sparks can't drop through. That could happen. Fire extinguisher equipment ready to use. This it can be pails of water, buckets of sand, hose, or portable extinguishers, depending on the material exposed. But you could see those is kind of an old standard in buckets of sand, not really what you'd consider much of a fire extinguisher anymore, although they could work. But generally speaking, you want a good fire extinguisher nearby. Depending on, well, you're probably an ABC fire extinguisher. But if you're welding, there's something that an ABC fire extinguisher can put out if it catches fire, then you probably need way more precautions than that. So fire watch when other than a minor fire might develop. Other than a minor fire might develop. So I think that minor fire, I think there's something there that's talking about very minor fire, or any of these in the fire watch. If there's combustible material closer than 35 feet, combustible materials further than 35 feet, but are easily ignited by sparks, wall and floor openings within 35 feet, exposed combustible materials. Now, 35 feet, how big is 35 feet? Well, we're not in a classroom, but if you've been in one of the classrooms at Carl Albert, and the 35 feet is just about the width of the long length or length, when they call it, of that classroom from wall to wall, the longest distance, almost 35 feet. So, or actually, it's a little over 35 feet. So 35 feet is almost from wall to wall. That's pretty far. Combustibles adjacent to opposite sides of metal wall or floor are likely to be ignited by conduction or radiation. So if you have a metal wall and it gets so hot, it might catch something on fire on the other side. Now, fire watchers shall have fire extinguisher equipment ready and be trained in its use. You just can't say, here's a fire extinguisher. Remember, not everybody knows how to use a fire extinguisher. You got to train them how to use it. Be familiar with facilities for sounding alarm in the event of a fire. They have to be taught, okay, what do you do if there is a fire? How do you sound the alarm? When do you sound the alarm? All right. Watch for fire in all exposed areas and only try to distinguish it if it's within the capacity of the equipment, or else sound the alarm. And it's probably a good idea to sound an alarm first and then try to extinguish it. You can always have, if the fire department shows up, you can always tell them you got it taken care of. They might not like it, but whatever. Be maintained for at least half hour after completion of hot work. This is a good idea. Now, we had some major operations going on in Fort Smith when I was there. And the vice president of operations was really, he must have had some bad, well, he did have some bad experiences with hot work. And he demanded that we have fire watchers 48 hours, because some of this stuff was done up in the roof, and where when they were down, there was nobody else around. So there could be stuff smoldering up there, and stuff does smolder. Trust me on that. It'll smolder. So, and that's fine. I was all for it. So we trained people in fire extinguisher use, and we had some people that just wanted to get some extra hours. To be honest with you, had 12-hour shifts, weekends, whatever, and all they did was fire watch for 12 hours at a time. And guess what? We didn't have any big problems. Authorization. Before cutting or welding, the area should be inspected by the individual responsible for authorizing such work. So you got to take a look around, right? I mean, that just makes sense. Now, it might not be the welder doing this. It might be the person that's told the welder to come out and do this. The person shall designate precautions to be followed in granting authorization, preferably in a written permit. That's what it says in this standard, preferably in a written permit. Now, there are times when a written hot work permit is required, such as if your business is involved or comes under process safety management, then it must be. But maybe your company should have a permit program, and that's a good idea too. You could say anything worked out outside the shop or whatever, but it's up to, every company has their own things. But so that says preferably. It doesn't say it's required. So the written permit's not required just for general welding here, unless you come under some other thing that tells you it is. Floors of combustibles present swept clean for a radius of 35 feet. Okay, now radius of 35 feet, that's a lot of area. Combustible floors like wood floors, kept wet, covered with damp sand or fire-resistant shields. If floors are wet, arc welding operators must be protected from the shock. Prohibited areas not authorized by management. In sprinkler buildings, while such protection is impaired, that's right out of the standard. If you have a sprinkler building and that sprinkling the system doesn't work, you are not allowed to be welding in it. And explosive atmospheres are where they may develop. You think about that sprinkler. Remember, welding, just by the definition, or hot work by the definition, is creating a flame. So it's heightened hazard. There's no doubt about it. Near large quantities of exposed, readily ightable materials such as bulk sulfur, baled paper, or cotton. I'll never forget one. OK Foods had a building. One side was a truck shop, one side was a welding shop, and there was just a wall. But you could walk from one to the other inside. And so I was up there having my truck service up. So I kind of walked through the way you went through to go to the other side. And in this welding shop, not quite out where they're welding, but in this welding shop, there's a bale in there. A bale of horse baled from the field, baled hay or whatever you want to call it, baled hay. And then I went a little bit ballistic. I says, come on, guys. I can't believe you've had this in your welding shop after all we went through to get this place and covered up all the wood and all this stuff went through to make sure there were no flammables. And you bring a bale of hay into here. They were kind of embarrassed about it. It never happened again. So they should have been embarrassed. They should be damn lucky I caught it and wasn't the fire department that had to come put it out. So anyhow, that's kind of your roles in the safety department. Sometimes that's what you have to do. People just don't think about safety sometimes. A relocation of combustibles, where possible, 35 feet from the work site. If relocation is impracticable, flame-proof covers or metal or asbestos guards or curtains. Again, this has we did at the Heavener plant a lot. We used a lot of these flame-proof covers and curtains. Ducts and conveyor systems might carry sparks protected or shut down. That's very possible, especially if it's you're welding in some place that's operational. You have air going through it. Spark gets up there and carries it down the ductwork and out somewhere. Could be a long ways away. Combustible walls, ceilings, etc. You have fire-resistant shields. Non-combustible walls, if it's done on metal, take precaution to prevent ignition on the other side, such as relocation of stuff on the other side, or maybe you have a fire watch on the other side if it gets hot enough. If you're welding on that wall or near it, does it get hot enough? It'd take a lot to do that, but it could happen. Combustible walls cover welding not permitted on metal walls, etc., having combustible covering, nor on walls, etc., of combustible sandwich type panels. There are some walls that have combustible stuff in the middle. If you start welding on those, you're not allowed to weld on those, because if you do, you can get you set that stuff in the fire. And again, there's a lot of stuff, and that's the type of stuff that will smolder and burn for a long time. Pipes or other metals in contact with combustible walls, no welding or cutting if work is close enough to cause ignition by conduction. So management, establish areas for cutting and welding and procedures for cutting and welding in other areas. And that's what we did at OK Foods. We had welding shops. And again, the welding shops couldn't have any flammables in there, and they'd bring it once in a while, they'd bring a wood pallet in there, and I would have to get on them about it. Come on, guys. And we went through, had a program, went through all the shops in all the different buildings and made sure we got all the stuff out. Some of them had wood walls, and we covered them up with metal. So we did a big program about it, and it must have worked because we didn't have really any problems after that. Designated individual responsible for authorizing cutting and welding in areas not specifically designed for such work. Again, when you're welding in the shop, shouldn't be a problem. But if you're outside the shop, out in the plant somewhere, or who knows where you could be, make sure that maybe somebody is responsible for authorizing that first. See, the cutters and welders are suitably trained in safe operations. Boy, that's, yeah, you'd think that would go without saying, but no, you got to say it. They got to be trained. There's no doubt about it. Advise all contractors about flammable materials or hazardous conditions. That's a good idea when you're dealing with contractors, and you're probably going to deal with contractors sooner or later. So supervisors responsible for safe handling and use of equipment determine combustible materials and hazardous areas present or likely to be present in the work location. Protect combustibles ignition by moving the work location free of combustibles. We kind of talked about that. Move it out of there. If it can't be moved, move the work to the location. If you can't move the work, have combustibles moved or shielded. So if you can't move the work, then you got to move the combustibles. Got to do one or the other. And see that cutting, or you can help by seeing that cutting or welding is scheduled so that plant operations that might expose combustibles are not started during cutting and welding. So that's a possibility there, depending on what your product is. They should secure authorization from designated management representative. Determine that cutter welder secures approval that conditions are safe before proceeding. Again, somebody's got to be responsible for securing that approval. Somebody has to know what they're doing to be sure they inspect the area before they let them do it. Determine that fire protection and extinguishing equipment are on site. See that fire watches are on site if they're required. Cutting or welding only in areas made fire safe. When work cannot be moved, again, areas shall be made safe by removing combustibles or protecting them from ignition sources. Welding or cutting containers. No hot work on used containers until they are cleaned so thoroughly as to make absolutely certain no dangers exist. Pipelines must be deconnected or blanked. This is a big thing, believe me. If you have a container especially a container that at one time held something flammable, it could have been 10 years ago. The container had been sitting around, don't worry about it, it's 10-year old. No, guess what? There's fumes in there. And fumes in a small space like a container are a bomb, really. And you start cutting on that thing and it's liable to blow up. And it happens. Now, so they should be cleaned so thoroughly and as to make absolutely certain no danger exists. Or I think you may mention that in one of the videos, you just don't allow it. That's a good idea. Just don't allow it. Purging with inert gas recommended. So you have to get an inert gas and purge that to get the fumes out of it. So, but again, my guess is you have a company policy. If it was up to me, I think I just wouldn't let them do it. All right, or somebody pretty important would have to do it and have to sign off on it. To get somebody to sign off on a permit to do that, and you'll find out they're a lot more careful about giving their authority rather than just say, yeah, go ahead. Well, I got to sign my name to that. Well, let me take a look at it. So some definitions as used herein, they're talking about confined space, and they talk about this a couple of times here. And so but they're talking about not a quote permit required confined space necessarily, but a small tank or boiler, a compartment inside a ship or something. So during breaks like lunch or overnight, that you want to arc weld and remove the electrodes from holders located to prevent accidental contact, and you want to disconnect it from a power source. And torch gas fuel welding, close and supply shut off outside the confined space. If practical, remove the torch and hose from the confined space. So what happens with anything that has gas, compressed gas, anything like in your gas welding, you get leaks sometimes. Sometimes just minuscule leaks that normally you wouldn't even notice. But if that minuscule leak is in a confined space for a period of time, it can build up to a explosive atmosphere, and it happens. If you're working on platforms, you have to have railings for fall protection, just like you would for anything else, fall protection. Welding cables keep the equipment clear of passages, ways, ladders, and stairways. Don't have your cables all over the place. Eye protection, use suitable eye protection. Helpers or attendants must have proper eye protection also. Now, I've seen cases of this. People welding out in the plant at OK Foods, and they got a welder, and he's all decked out with all the stuff, and he ain't got a helper, somebody helped him out, and the helper doesn't have anything. I said, wait a minute, the helper's just as exposed to this, looking at this flame as anybody else. That helper needs to have the same eye protection as the welder. I mean, I'm not looking when they're welding. Bull pucky, you're going to look. Besides, you could be looking away, and in a chicken plant or poultry processing plant with stainless steel, that reflection can also damage your eyes. And I heard that from somebody that I know very well, to be honest, and it happened to him. So proper lenses and the shade numbers there, and in the standard right there, 1910-252 B2 IIH has different shade numbers for different types of welding and tips. So that's very detailed information that the welder needs to know. Arc welding arrays enclosed in a booth are used non-combustible screens to keep the rays from anybody else. Appropriate clothing for the operation. Again, there's the videos you see that especially when on a fuel gas has a lot of stuff about the clothing. Again, there's very few confined spaces. Again, small, which again is just a small compartment. Adequate ventilation. Leave gas cylinders and welding machines outside that space if possible. And if it's a really small, like a manhole or something you're down in, or something like that, maybe you need a lifeline, attendant, and rescue procedures. You might need to have that. If operations are suspended, remove electrodes from holders to prevent accidental contact. And if operations are suspended, that means for lunch, breaks, or overnight, shut off the fuel from outside a confined space. And then health protection, contamination coming from the dimensions of the space which welding is done, the number of welders, there may be more than one in there. Possible evolution of hazardous fumes, gases, or dust according to the metals involved. Screens, make sure the screens don't restrict ventilation, and they should be about 2 feet above floor. I left out a 2, unless the work performance is very low there. And the screens are there to protect not just sparks, but also anybody that's walking by from their eyesight from not being able to look at the welding. Local exhaust or general ventilating system to keep concentrations below what's specified 1910.1000. Hazard communication. These welders have to know the fluxes, coatings, and everything else. They have to have access to labels and safety data sheets and trained. They have to know what they're working with, part of hazard communication. 1910.252 contains a lot of information on these specific hazards: fluorine compounds, zinc, lead, beryllium, cadmium, mercury, cleaning compounds, stainless steel. And so one of the hazards of welding on stainless steel was hexavalent chromium. And at one of the conferences we had in the Poultry Federation, or what it was called, had the safety conferences every year. And they were always usually in Georgia, because Georgia is the #1 poultry processing state in the United States. And one of the round tables we had, one of the companies did testing of the hexavalent chromium, and they said for normal welding on the steel that they didn't even get a reading. They had to have actually more welding going on than normal, a lot more, to even get a reading on the hexavalent chromium. So, but that is a factor though if you're welding stainless steel. First aid equipment, of course, should be available at all times, and that's just anywhere you have anything, but particularly with welding, because there's a lot of hazards there. So 1910-253 is oxygen fuel gas welding and cutting, and it has detailed procedures. And many of the safety aspects of this are covered in the video regarding this module, but you should read the standard. There's a lot of information. I'm not going to go over all that. And 254 for arc welding and cutting has the same thing, a lot of detailed procedures. And again, many of these safety aspects are covered in the video that accompanies this. Those 2 videos are really good. So now, if your facility falls under process safety management, which is 29 CFR 1910.119, a hot work permit is required for any hot work on or near a covered process. So in the case of anhydrous ammonia at OK Foods, so it was anywhere on or near anything involving ammonia, then we had to have a hot work permit. And we just about made everybody in a plant use a hot work permit. And that was the Heaver plant. That was a big, that was an issue, but it was something that the contractors didn't want to do. We made them do it. So that's it on welding, for welding operations. Again, those 2 videos are really good. Welding, just by definition, has a lot of hazards: heat, flame, light radiation. There's just a lot of things involved in it. So anytime that you're involved in this, safety has to be really, really pushed, because everybody gets complacent after a while too. So, and if you have contractors, they're going to want to finish the job. They'll take their chances, and you can't let them do that. So anyhow, this is a pretty good chapter, I think, with a lot of good stuff in it. even if you're not a welder. So enjoy and be safe.